Mrs. Gutierrez was in the kitchen and did not want to leave here at all. Soon her son's wife will come, and she didn't want to see her, would not want to talk to her. Last thing, their relationship has gotten so bad over time that they both could barely stand each other. If Mrs. Gutierrez was always ready to compromise, that Laura didn't want to give up on her. Every once, when she came home, she collected her hair, hightail, pulled on her robe and turned into a real vixen, ready to attack the unfortunate old woman at any time. Mrs. Gutierrez looked out the window not because that I liked the beautiful autumn landscape, and therefore, what did she expect? That the wife is about to come, her son. Sometimes I really wanted to go there again. Where did she live before? But she couldn't afford it. Son brought it from the village, and she had to stay here, so that he could solve all his affairs, make repairs in that house, as he promised, then she would come back. But if initially Mrs. Gutierrez expected that will return literally in the same year, then all her calculations were wrong. At first she thought, what will be back in a month, but nothing happened. After the deadline had been pushed back, more and more, she stayed here. A tall young woman just seemed around the corner. She was arguing with someone on the phone, which was completely unsurprising for her. Mrs. Gutierrez grimaced all over. She knew that this is her daughter-in-law, and would like to go to the store right now or talk on the phone longer, so that the unfortunate old woman could be at home in peace and quiet, at least half an hour longer than usual. But how bad, Laura didn't mean to be distracted. She walked towards the entrance, hung up the call, looked up, waved Mrs. Gutierrez's narrow long hand. She is mocking her. Mrs. Gutierrez felt that this situation is getting worse and that the longer she lives here, the worse it gets. I just had to talk to my son, to help her, to bring her back, even if the repair is not finished there. Well, how was your day? Did nothing again, sticking out near the window. How as if we took you, so that you sit like this and do nothing, said Laura. I already erase you, clean up, look after you, cook, and you tell me that I don't do anything. Cold, Laura, nothing, it's useless to talk here. If you don't care about all sins always, the woman said guiltily. But at the same time, she tried very hard to restrain herself. Oops, you might think soup was boiled all at work foxes, said Laura, and the old lady grimaced. Understand, then it will be impossible to explain something. We are with your son. By the way, we work to put your house in order and to make you more or less, at least comfortable. But what are you cooking, clean up? It's all on our money, so don't forget, said Laura. Her triumph still smiled, and in general her face expressed a rather ambiguous emotion, but it was not visible that she had already won this verbal battle in her head. But at the same time, a smile of contempt was added to the solemnity on her face. Her mother hated her husband when she wanted them. Didn't fight too much, at least, Laura did not start one. Laura itself was quite scandalous, and therefore no wonder that almost every conversation they had ended in some kind of skirmish. They fought almost until the evening. Or rather, Laura cursed Mrs. Gutierrez, and the old woman just endured everything and insults and tried to pretend that she has nothing to do with. You know, I thought here we are arguing, but I really can't stand you, admitted Laura. Her honesty earned even some respect. Mrs. Gutierrez. Already it would be better if she always told the truth. What did you try to disguise? And she couldn't speak her mind. Us, by the way, family. We are working with your son, and you, instead of giving us this house in the country, you're not going to do it. You are already old. Come into some nursing home and that's it. We would have our own house. Now I'm so old. You, when you are my age too, understand that even at my age I want to live, said Mrs. Gutierrez. I would gladly live somewhere else, but it's too early to go to the nursing home. I have nothing to write about yet. Laura grimaced, wanting to say something, but then the front door clicked. Albert entered the apartment. He was terribly tired, exhausted. Everyone by his appearance showed that just catastrophically tired. He was pale, he obviously had a lot of problems, and he didn't want to deal with all these shreds. Albert, your mom is arguing again, said Laura, without taking your eyes off Mrs. Gutierrez, who is used to that she constantly substitutes and And we are working, we get tired, she is at home, still scandals roll up to us. Laura, let's talk later, let me at least put myself in order, Albert said. He was so tired, unhappy, that his mother was worried about him. I haven't seen him like this in a long time. At all Mrs. Gutierrez did not have. Very sorry, Albert, especially given that, what is the difficult situation he is in now? To him it was extremely difficult now to deal with those difficulties, who fell on him. Besides, his mother felt him, what else is there that, what he doesn't tell his wife, maybe he doesn't tell his mother, and something was eating him from the inside, not letting him live normally. But you will fix yourself, she will continue to bully me, said Laura. Voice she sounded very loud. She corrected immediately, uttered this phrase again, and now stared at her husband. Everyone was waiting, until he answered something worthy. Until you put your mother in her place, but he was still silent. Laura, how much can you lie shamelessly? Nobody doesn't touch you, you come in from work and from the threshold you start to run into me, then, as soon as my son comes home, you start talking, what is it all I do? Couldn't stand it, Mrs. Gutierrez. Tio, which I completely felt superfluous in this house. Listen, but you are adults, can't you really solve this issue yourself then seriously? Well, how can I at that bench, Reconciliation Village, all figured out, discussed, found a compromise, all, minted Albert, obviously dissatisfied, that he has to explain such elementary things. He waved his hand at them and went to the glazed balcony, where he spent a lot of time. This was his small office, where there was a table, a computer and a night city, that opened outside the windows, comforted him, allowing him to focus solely on work. He was tired of these scandals, but even more tired of the problems, who literally pursued him. He would be happy to solve all these problems, but the further the situation worsened, the more he understood, which is most likely, getting out of this on your own will be almost impossible. When the door slowly opened, he immediately understood that Mother would enter. Laura felt like home, never knocked, flew into his office like a fury and began to establish their own rules. His mother always came in very quietly, always knocked, apologized repeatedly, before entering. He looked at her tired, tormented look. I worry about my son only getting stronger. Ma'am, I have so many problems, you add them to me, he said, looking at her. I don't know how to get out here. I'm coming home, somewhere to rest in peace, but only do, as I hear, to doggy style here. Listen, son, but maybe you can take me back, and let the unfinished repair there live in Sky's house. I won't interfere, you will have fewer scandals here. Now I can get along with your wife, for the life of me, I do not understand how to even talk to her, because she twists everything so that I seem to run into her, but she is satisfied, I don't bully every day. I elderly person, I need peace, care. Yes, I can do all of this myself. Just take me back to the village, said the old lady. She tried to speak quietly and calmly. I tried to choose my words carefully. He looked at Mother, not knowing how to explain that he simply cannot take her to that very house. He clenched cheekbones, and she immediately understood by his that something is going on, and she doesn't know anything about it yet. She looked at him carefully. He just looked at her, shook his head. She saw that he is preparing to talk right now, which seems so unpleasant, that she will clearly remember him for a long time. She sat next to me in a chair, to make it easier for him to speak. Looking at the door, tried to understand, is his wife eavesdropping? But then the phone rang, footsteps were heard and the annoyed voice of his wife was heard, who spoke to someone in a raised voice. This was the perfect time to talk, so he immediately took advantage of this opportunity. Ma'am, I'll tell you something, but you promise that you won't tell my wife anything. You know how she reacts to everything? Now I want to get involved in all this again, and start another scandal. Furthermore, that no scandal can fix the situation now, said Albert, and she, still looking at him, with anxiety, nodded. I am here in the forest, in a very bad situation. Money I needed. I lied to you. I went to your house not for that, to repair it. I just redid the paperwork, and the house was sold. So that you are no longer at home, because I needed money. She looked at her son and did not believe her own ears. She could never understand what happened, that he suddenly decided that can leave her without a roof over her head, just to solve my own problems. All this time, while she lived with her son, she thought that she had a roof over her head, a house, where she could always return. That's not to mention that this house kept many memories, which she loved so much and cherished so much. Now it turns out that she has absolutely nothing to return and nowhere. You besides the same girl, that right now she was yelling at someone on the phone. Didn't even know what was going on. Mrs. Gutierrez understood that most of the harassment from this girl was precisely that she wanted to get a house. Nothing to say, you disappoint me, son, she said honestly. This same, shaking his head, barely holding back the tears. Women still have to say, she can't stand me from for that I did not give you this house for life. Yes, I know, I try to delay this moment as much as possible. I generally think that maybe we are with her for more than a year and will not last, Albert said, and in his voice one could hear just a titanic fatigue. She patted her son on the head, from how hard it is for him. She was still mad at him. Eventually, he climbed into this situation with a lack of money on his own. I had to decide on my own, and not at the expense of his mother's property. Really, and the truth is now you have to return to the nursing home. She is not afraid to be in this place, but hopes she will be there much later, having spent a lot of time, by itself, in the backyard of your house. Even in her old age, her son simply took away this opportunity from her. I won't apologize, I'll tell you honestly. I think that I did the right thing, if I didn't sell your house. If I would leave everything as it is, I would no longer be alive, Albert said, taking out cigarettes and immediately lighting up, now talking already cigarettes in your teeth. Alone guilty, that got involved in it all. But when you get involved, you want to make every effort to get out of this situation. His mother just shook her head, and then left, leaving him alone. She didn't know what he would think, or what would go on in his head. Knew she's the only one, that she is terribly disappointed in him, and that she did not expect such an act from him at all. It was very sad and bitter to realize that her home, which she loved so much, now left completely abandoned, no one needed, maybe it will even be demolished. She grew up in this house, raised children there. She just lived there happily, until her husband passed away, until the kids were grown, didn't leave, and the son did not get such a strange woman, who could not find a common language with anyone. Mrs. Gutierrez went to the living room. I made my sofa and lay down, to try to sleep, at least pretend, to Laura, and I did not touch it. The next morning she felt worse. Heart he was pounding, sweating quickly appeared then and something froze again. You look bad, said Laura, going to work. Maybe call an ambulance for you? No, old age, all old age, repeated Mrs. Gutierrez. Laura, although her health was coping, there was no sincerity in these words, because she said it only because of that there was a husband. If he would have left for work by now, she wouldn't even notice Mrs. Gutierrez and her condition. But Mrs. Gutierrez hoped that the state would become easier, and it would become easier literally the next day. But every day the situation worsened. She understood more and more, something bad was happening to her. She felt how it weakens and how with each note I only get worse. Yes, it's all over. I urgently need another dose, heard Mrs. Gutierrez through a dream. Voice Inga sounded very quiet, almost in a whisper, but because she was very nervous, then her voice carried through the empty apartment, as if she was speaking into a loudspeaker, and for her own nervousness, more likely, didn't even notice it. Mrs. Gutierrez raised the sofa a little, wanted to get up, but knew that as soon as she got up, the sofa would creak, and besides, she was now so dizzy that she couldn't even go to the toilet on her own, and didn't hold on to the walls. I don't know, I already thought that by then everything will be done. She was some kind of survivor, Laura said unhappily, and everything became clear. Mrs. Gutierrez understood that wife, her son will poison her and who knows what, but it was clear that the longer she stays here, the worse it will be for her, until she's completely screwed up here. Mrs. Gutierrez lay down again, presented, What if she is still conscious tomorrow? What if she won't eat anything until tomorrow, nor drink, that, maybe, can call soon as he leaves for work Laura and her son. She won't tell his son, because he still won't believe her. Again shielding my wife, whatever it is. How only the next day Laura went to work, outraged by that the old woman did not drink water, who brought it, and Mrs. Gutierrez started looking for a phone. But Laura probably took all the phones and there was not a single device from which to call. Fawcett felt that's about to lose consciousness, left the apartment, knocked on the door next door and only had time to say that she needed an ambulance, and then passed out. Mrs. Gutierrez woke up in intensive care, but the doctor surrounded and again added something to the drip and she again turned off. Someone kept talking, and she almost did not think. Through some kind of oblivion she saw doctors and sisters, and they all circled around her, apparently trying to get her literally from the other world. When Mrs. Gutierrez woke up next time, she was already in the room. Around she had no fuss, and she just stared at the snow-white ceiling, which gleamed pleasantly from the frequency, reflecting the rays of the sun that hit the windows. I even thought that you won't wake up. Sorry, what I'm saying, but true, your condition was very difficult, you had severe poisoning. Your age is almost equal to death. Cold, I'll call your children now, let them pick you up. No, 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 protested Mrs. Gutierrez, I am asking you, can't go home. Tell my children that I died, otherwise if I get home, I really will die. Doctor stared at her, completely unaware what to do in such a situation, wanting to go out and consult with colleagues. Well, the old woman immediately raised her hand, tried to get up, and he hurried to her, so she didn't do it. Tell him that I died, to you that, what is it worth, pull time, and then you say that I bequeath myself to science, so they won't get anybody. Legacy I don't have any, so they don't have to wait, and I will give you my card, let the ward pay for now, while I figure it out. What should I do? Said Mrs. Gutierrez. Doctor, who looked at her in bewilderment, felt sorry for her sympathy. He and I were afraid, when it gets old, the kids will throw it. To him you have to stay in the hospital. Fear of returning home, where he can be poisoned for the sake of an inheritance or for the sake of extra square meters. Mrs. Gutierrez discovered for the first time in a long time that her head is fresh and that without all those drugs, with which Laura stuffed her, she feels much better. She lay in the room, thought about it, how were the news received, but knew that he doesn't react at all, because for him it was the most important thing is to please your wife, even if it cost his mother's life. Yes, and then, as it turned out, she has been in the hospital for several hours, as she thought, but a few days. But not son, not Laura never came to her, to at least visit her or at least get to know how she feels. To her it was a shame that the children are so cruel to her, but she had already come to terms with it and forced herself to focus on finding a solution, where to dress after, how will she get out of the hospital, because otherwise you will have to stay on the street. When Albert entered the hospital, he did not know what to expect from a doctor, but secretly he expected what the doctor would tell him, that his mother is no more, that he sympathizes and stuff like that. He was already tired of enduring constant scandals from mother and wife. And we will now be much easier, if motives rest in peace and no longer have to listen to not your wife, not the indignation of the mother about the house given to them. He was terribly tired. Even now he could hardly stand on his feet, but came to know the news, which, maybe, would make him happy. To me seems, what would be the best way out for us now, if she didn't wake up there? Honestly, said Laura, choosing words carefully, so that the husband does not guess which is to blame, that his mother was in the hospital, she really was. Here only Laura expected a completely different outcome. She hoped that from their apartment, the mother would immediately go to the funeral home, then to the cemetery and never get into intensive care. Laura understood that the old woman could simply guess that, what's happening, so I left the apartment, reached out to a neighbor, and called an ambulance. But she knew that old woman, despite what's happening, still didn't go to the police. Laura knows what a woman is, despite their nature, loves his son very much and will not spoil his life. When the doctor came and told them that mother was dead, Albert looked at him dumbfounded, not allowing a single tear. Here is Laura, apparently having decided that now you can just practice acting skills, rolled up a whole theater of one actor, crying alive, moaning. Even a doctor to whom, in fact, had nothing to do with it, saw, she's just playing. Albert surprised myself, looking at your wife, but it seemed that she suffers amazingly believable. All, stop making comedy, go to the car, Albert said, and she is now realizing how stupid it looked all this time, immediately turned around and walked towards the car, and over Falcon's sharp heels making an unpleasant sound. When you can take the body, Albert said, still looking at the doctor, who immediately understood that the old woman obviously does not want to return to this family, not only because of her daughter-in-law, but because of the indifference of her son. She bequeathed her body of science, so you don't have to worry about the funeral. If you will need a paper death certificate, then you will need to wait at least a few months, before everything more or less settles down. Themselves understand, we found so many poisons in her blood, that we can't just put everything on the brakes, said the doctor. Albert nodded, and left the hospital building. He did not need this certificate, because the mother's inheritance was no more. The only thing, what could she leave her children, he just sold, literally gave for a penny, to pay off debts. He replayed it in my head, what should he do now, but one thought that the house will become quieter and calmer, much more concerned about him, than even the death of his own mother. When Albert got into the car, his wife was already very nervous and began to bite her nails again, from which fingers and very soon will become like some kind of nightmare. Albert exhaled, leaned back in the car seat and felt a headache, which originated somewhere in the back of the head, gradually moving to the forehead. He didn't want to talk to my wife, did not want to discuss the death of his mother, but he didn't want to make his wife stutter. Legacy, which she was waiting for. Listen, let's do it. I know, what do you want to chat about, but let's go home. My head hurts so much, what if you hit me, then believe, it doesn't seem like much, Albert warned her. She nodded, obviously not going to talk now. She wanted to come home, have a drink and just relax. Outside bubbling with so many positive emotions, that she didn't even know how to calm down. She didn't even know how much she would still rejoice at this event. But one thing was clear, everything in her life will turn out just like that. How did she expect? I was uneasy at the thought, now what, when they don't get a house, when they move to the village, she can open her own little business there, will earn, will constantly limit, or maybe vice versa, make your husband work, and she won't do anything at all, except for herself. She looked forward to a happy future, and the rest of her life seemed to run before her eyes of meaning. I saw her happy face, and he began to have vague doubts. All of a sudden the wife became guilty. His mother was in intensive care. But as it were, he didn't want to deal with all this. How there wouldn't be any, and the police wouldn't fit into it all, which means, his wife was safe, and he himself could finally exhale. When they came, she calmed down a bit, but still could not hide the cheerful expression that appeared on her face. She literally shone, and he saw that the death of his mother clearly benefited, as creepy as it sounds. Here, how do we get the papers? How do we get an inheritance and all? After that you can't cry at all. Let's move into this huge house or sell it for some crazy money, considering how old it is. Beautiful, a real piece of architectural art. We will have so much money. Business open, stop needing money. I'm afraid to even imagine, how will we feel good, said Laura. She removed outer clothing, kicked off her shoes, and collapsed on the sofa. She threw her legs on the arm of the sofa and now, smiling, she giggled softly, looking at your husband. But she saw that his face was gloomy, however, it chalked it up to grief. Absolutely unknowingly, what will he say to her now? He sat next to her, and she, still looking him straight in the eye, continued to smile at the hope that because of her smile, he will smile too. Cold, now there's no point in hiding anything. But no inheritance, he said, in spite of her. And what is the meaning of this, she asked, and the smile instantly disappeared from her face. She looked at him. Understand that there is no turning back, I continued talking. More half a year ago, as soon as the mother was taken away from there, didn't do any repairs. I got into trouble. I have a lot of debt, and I sold this house to pay off debts and took money for repairs and the family budget. This everything was out of repair, to pay off debts, he said. See how every word he says changes her expression. At first she looked at him as if through the dust and to the point of doubt, then there was a misunderstanding, and then anger, which turned out to be the most dangerous for him. Found out that without a scandal, this conversation will end in nothing. And therefore prepared for it, that will withstand its onslaught. But so far she was only looking at him and apparently saying something in her head. What's happened? Maybe trying to convince myself that all this is really happening right. I understand that all this time, while I fought your mother's inheritance, you just sold that house a long time ago. She spoke relatively calmly, but he saw that she started to boil, like an old kettle. He kept silent, and eventually, silence now was the safest. She rose, became, hovering over him, still not believing my own ears. She swallowed, and he understood that her condition is only getting worse, and if now he himself does not speak to her, then it explodes. You do not understand, in what situation I would not understand you, how hard it was for me and that I fought for my own life. You at least understand how hard it was for me, he asked, start yelling at her, to make her feel guilty about everything. But she was not so easy, and brought her emotions, although it was easy, but she did a great job, that she's not to blame. Yes, I do not care. You at least you know, what step did I take, to get this legacy? Yes, I ruined my soul until the end of my days. I thought you and I will sell this house or move, somehow change our lives. Turns out, something on the sly, secret from me, from his mother, stupidly sold. From about volume. She was amazed, not believing in their own words and not believing what a man, whom she loved, whom she trusted, could do to her. He fell silent again. Speak now, it was redundant. He wanted to make her scream, let it slip, and then it would be easier to find a common language with her. Certainly, scandals that could last several hours, but sooner or later she will give up. He will be able to talk, not discuss, what to do next. She didn't even suspect that even selling the house, he gave only a fifth of that huge debt, which had to be delivered as soon as possible. Mrs. Gutierrez sat in her room, looked out the window and did not come up with anything that could help her. She didn't know where to go. Should she return to the village to an old friend? Maybe should have left. Really, to a nursing home, where will they care? Mrs. Gutierrez, they came for you, said the doctor, looking into the room, and there was a strange smile on his face, as if he had stopped wearing a vest and was now glad for. How is the situation? Who I arrived? She asked in surprise, rising and feeling, which made it much easier. Not I know, some girl says that she is your relative, new. Just see her, immediately understand, said the doctor, and an old lady, understanding that she has no other choice, decided to leave anyway. But when she left the reception, when I saw that girl, who came for her, she was completely speechless. She had the same almond-shaped eyes, like her husband, and they were the same turquoise. How is he? All the same blonde hair and even facial features, only much prettier, much more feminine than her husband had. 1,000 thoughts ran through her mind, but one thing was clear for sure, in front of her is clearly the daughter of her husband. Get ready, we can talk on the way. What did the girl say to you? Mrs. Gutierrez, without saying a single word, decided to surrender to fate. She returned to the room, packed all my things there and now, going back to the reception, walking next to this girl, but still didn't talk to him. Really all this time he's been cheating. She so loved him, and it seemed that they lived soul to soul, and he was giving it all the time. She didn't fit in her head. How could he do this to her, just using it, enjoying the comfort, but while constantly pacing to the left? She got into the car started moving, and when they had already left the city, the old lady couldn't resist, turned to this girl, but she just smiled. If there was no anger in her smile, there was only some kindness and some kind of awareness that, no matter how she put off this conversation, still needed to talk. I know, what do you, when they looked at me, immediately understood everything. I know, what for you, Especially after such a difficult situation, what happened in your life, it'll all be another blow. But perhaps I'm the only person who you have left. But I hasten to disappoint you. Actually, I'm not your husband's daughter, she said. With a smile, still looking dumbfounded while old woman. But you look so much like him, she said, and the girl laughed. Yes, I know. Here only I don't look like your husband, she is his brother. You, maybe, didn't even know, but he has a brother, with whom he had not spoken for many years. So already gone, that they had a very strong fight and quarreled so much that they could not reconcile even to death. My brother and I were very similar, almost like twins, Asya. Difference between them was almost 4 years old. Cold, it doesn't matter anymore. Main, that at least we got to know each other. I found out about you through a mutual friend, who told me that you are now in a difficult position. I found out about your son and the same went to the hospital, to find out about your body and bury you with dignity. Turns out that you are alive, that I just need to pick you up, said the girl. Better don't ask, what roundabout ways I found out all this and what's next. I don't want to sit on my neck, especially, that you hardly know me, said the old lady, addressing her, and it was so embarrassing that she didn't even know her relatives. But even more embarrassing, that she suspected her husband of treason. I live alone in a large urban-type settlement. You me a pretty big house, have a dog, but she is very kind. Big flower garden. Believe, you will always have a place, how to be with me, just to be alone. If you get tired of my company, I'll belly, and for some time decide that it will continue, and therefore your company will not only benefit. Not to worry, everything will be okay, she said with a smile, but for some reason decided to follow me. You don't even know me, it turns out, you by blood and not a relative at all, surprised Mrs. Gutierrez. She and I were really surprised by this, because in the end, even her own son simply abandoned her, and decided to take the side of his wife, who wanted to poison her for her inheritance. Then some relatively strange girl came for her, to pick her up and have her spend the rest of her life with her. You know, my father was a very cruel man. Your husband didn't tell you, but he always defended me, always stood up for me and treated me with much more kindness than my father and my uncle. Your husband always spoke of you with such love, with such tenderness, and I've always wanted to meet you. I let by blood I'm not your relative, but I think that we can become a real family, summed up the girl. Not a month has passed. How did they start living together? How did they understand that they can really live together? News if you don't swear and just enjoy each other's company. Every day Mrs. Gutierrez woke up. In the morning she thanked this girl for what she decided to take. I don't even really know her. She didn't remember my son, sometimes only thoughts and wandered, but she returned to thoughts of home, to my savior, not to think about the fight of the mouth. All her life has changed dramatically, but most importantly, that she was able to find a family, despite what a family it was in blood.